Hey everyone, this is Tammy Painter, and you're listening to the Book Out Podcast, the podcast where I entertain your inner book nerd with tales of quirky books and literary lore. And yes, I do record that intro every single time, so I don't know, I just feel like maybe I should mix it up a bit now and then. But, I don't know. So we are on lucky number 13 for this episode, and this time we're talking about a pioneering young woman named Nellie Bly. And if you've never heard of her, you're probably not alone. Although, I don't know, I'm not totally sure about this, but I think there's a movie being made about her exploits. Anyway, she was quite the go-getter in the writing world, and in Jules Verne's world. But before we start, I need to confess that I screwed up. In episode 12, while I was rambling on about Agatha Christie, I kind of missed a beat and said something like, in 1914, World War II broke out. Yeah, that would be World War I going on in 1914. And thanks to David Anderson for catching that flub and for teasing me about it. But I'll let him get away with that because he is my husband. But the next time he makes a mistake, yeah. Anyway, I did add the correction to the show notes for that episode. I just hope no historians start trolling me online or anything. Also, I just want to say thank you to everyone who, despite the errors, enjoyed the Agatha Christie episode, and a special thanks goes to Lavelle Stumpf, aka my mom, and Tierney of TierneyCreates.com for leaving comments about how much they liked the episode. Alright, so Nellie Bly. Who exactly was she, and what does she have to do with Jules Verne? Well, Nellie was a journalist, and while she didn't invent the notion of investigative journalism, she was one of the first ladies who showed women could be just as hard-hitting as male reporters. And if you're scratching your head wondering how this relates to Jules Verne, well, we have to take a couple steps back to the publication of his story, 80 Days Around the World. Now, I had kind of planned on doing a whole episode on 80 Days Around the World because I just read the book recently for the first time, and I absolutely loved it. But as I was reading it, or rather listening to it since I got the audiobook from the library, I just kept thinking about another book I'd read a few years ago titled 80 Days. And it recounted the true life competition of two women who were racing around the world as part of a newspaper stunt. And one of those women, as you might have guessed, was Nellie Bly. And so I thought it would be perfect to combine an 80 Days Around the World episode with her tenacious efforts to make her name in journalism. And stick with me here, this will all come together, I promise. Or at least I hope. So if you've never read it, 80 Days Around the World tells the tale of Phileas Fogg and his servant Passepartout going around the world in under 80 days. And they do this to win a £20,000 bet Phileas has made at his club in London. And poor Passepartout he's really put through his paces the entire way through the story. And to me, he really is the main character of 80 Days Around the World, although Phileas Fogg seems to get all the credit for that role. As many stories were done back then, the book was published in serial form, with the first installment coming out on the 2nd of October, 1872. And each week, or I'm not sure how often it came out, but each installment, people could watch the pair's journey through the Suez Canal, across India, where they stopped to rescue a princess, on to Singapore, San Francisco, New York, Ireland, then back to London. And the final installment came out on the 21st of December, the same day as the fictional Phileas is set to return to London. And you might know Jules Verne for his more science-based stories like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And science and technology does play a key part in the novel because he makes use of recent developments such as the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, the linking of the Indian railways, and the recent opening of the Suez Canal. And people were absolutely hooked on this story, so much so that they thought it might actually be real. They even started placing their own bets on whether or not Phileas would make it home in time. I couldn't find any word about how many people won or lost those bets. But in kind of a modern twist on, to show that things just really never changed, there is speculation that the book is basically a huge product placement ad because Verne gets very specific in naming certain trains and certain ships and their amenities. Hey, whatever you have to do to make a buck, right? So now we're going to go back to Nellie Bly. She was born in Pittsburgh in 1864 as Elizabeth Jane Cochran. And she did get a good basic elementary education, but when she tried to go on to higher education, she had to drop out after just a single term because she didn't have enough money for the tuition to keep going. And I just kind of love the story of how Elizabeth, future Nellie, gets her first writing gig. Basically, she gets angry and sends off a letter, because that's what people did back in the day before there were Twitter rants. See, in 1880, she had come across an article titled, "What Are Girls Good For?" which pretty much came straight out and said girls were good for nothing but keeping house and making babies. Yeah, I know. Anyway, Elizabeth zips off her letter to the jerk-faced newspaper under the name Nellie Bly, the pseudonym she would end up writing under for the rest of her career. And she used a pseudonym because women at the time really weren't supposed to express an opinion, obviously. And you didn't want to kind of like embarrass your family by sending off angry letters or writing scandalous things. Anyway, the editor of the newspaper ends up being so impressed with this mysterious Nellie's eloquence and reasoning, he puts out an ad asking her to reveal herself. Eventually she did, and she took a commission from him to write an article which ended up being about how divorce laws were set up to ruin a woman's life. And Mr. Editor is once again impressed and takes her on as one of the full-time writers for the newspaper. And Nellie jumps in with both feet, and she starts investigating the harsh lives of factory girls. The trouble was the owners of those factories didn't like their poor and downright dangerous working conditions being exposed. They complained to the newspaper, and Nellie ended up being demoted to writing articles on fashion and gardening. Big surprise, she didn't like this work. So at this point, she decides to take matters into her own hands and declares she's going to write something no one has ever seen before. Now, keep in mind, she's only 21 at this point, but she's decided she's going to be a real journalist and sets out on the road to be a foreign correspondent reporting from Mexico. While she's in Mexico, she gets to know the Mexican people and ends up writing a fairly well-received book about their lives. And she also, because she's gotten to know these people, she joins in on a few protests against the Mexican government. This doesn't go over well because dictators don't like protests. She gets threatened with arrest, she hightails it, and when she gets back to Pittsburgh, she writes some pretty damning reports about the tyrannical Mexican government. And despite all this, when she returns to work at the newspaper, they put her back on the fashion and gardening articles. I mean, what's a girl got to do? Well, a girl's got to move to New York, that's what. In 1887, she leaves Pittsburgh. She's completely broke, and she ends up talking her way into a job with the newspaper New York World. And it's here she really gets committed to her work. Literally. Because it's with the aim of revealing the horrible conditions within the mental asylum system that she purposely gets herself committed to the women's lunatic asylum. In the asylum, as expected, she discovers the utter brutality, cruelty, neglect, and just nasty living conditions. And she makes it through 10 days before the New York World pulls some strings and gets her released. She ends up writing not just an article exposing the horrors, but an entire book which stirred up such a sensation it ended up bringing reform to the asylum system. All of which means Nellie had just proved for the first time what girls were good for, and that women were skilled enough to be true reporters, not just writers of fluff pieces or baby makers. Now, don't worry, I haven't gone fully off track, because now we're up to 1888, when Nellie's reporting career meets up with 80 Days Around the World. So, in 1888, Nellie's looking for an idea and suggests testing out whether Verne's tale can actually be done. The editor sits on the idea, then in November 1889, he suddenly decides, yeah, that's a great idea. So, with literally 2 days' notice, she's told to get packed and get her butt around the world in 80 days or less. Nellie grabs nothing more than a small satchel, And I picture something like an old-timey doctor's bag. She takes this and to hold just a few toiletries and her underwear. She brings nothing to wear other than the dress she had on and her coat. And the only other item she brings is a couple $100 that she's tucked into a pouch she wears around her neck. I mean, talk about traveling light. Meanwhile, over at Cosmo, yes, the Cosmo, they've gotten wind of the scheme and send Elizabeth Bisland off on the same day, but in the opposite direction as Nellie. She's going east, the same as Phileas Fogg and Passepartout did in the Jules Verne story. And Bisland, and believe me, she's fooling no one, tells everyone she's doing it for a personal adventure, and she's not in any way competing with Nellie. I totally picture this statement being delivered with plenty of knowing eye winks. Nellie does follow Verne's route as closely as possible, and she even meets Jules Verne on the way. Although, unlike Phileas and Passepartout, she does not rescue an Indian princess. Such an underachiever, right? Anyway, while Nellie's away, just like people did with 80 Days Around the World, the New York World organizes a betting scheme, and whoever guesses the exact minute Nellie will arrive would win a free trip to Europe, not around the world. As she's traveling, people are able to keep up with her adventures and her progress because she's sending cables and telegraphs at each stop to report her progress, as well as longer dispatches that are sent by mail, which end up taking weeks to get to the newspaper. And she does really make good time until she hits bad weather making the crossing from Asia to San Francisco. This bad weather puts her 2 days behind schedule, and that means she's at risk of Bisland catching up, because Bisland's not doing too shabby. Well, Pulitzer, the Pulitzer, who I haven't mentioned yet, but he owns the New York World, is not about to risk losing this race. And so he hires a private train to whisk Nellie from the West Coast to New York, where she arrives at 3:51 p.m. on the 25th of January, 1890. 72 days after taking off, and at the time, that was a world record for going around the world. No word, again, these bets, I want to know the answers. There's no word on if anyone won that free trip to Europe, but Bisland wouldn't arrive back to New York for 4 more days. So, at least, second place, I guess. And this newspaper stunt wasn't the only time people have taken Verne's book as some sort of challenge. Plenty of people have done the whirlwind tour and continue to do it today. For example, in 1903, James Willis Sayre of Seattle made an around-the-world trip in only 54 days using nothing but public transportation. In 1928, which would have been Jules Verne's 100th birthday, a Dutch newspaper sponsored 15-year-old Paul Huld to go around the world by train and ship, and he made it in 44 days, but again, he did not rescue an Indian princess. Lame. And in 1988, Michael Palin of Monty Python fame did the around-the-world journey for a television program using only ground and sea transport, no airplanes, which I'm sure Greta Thunberg would love. And he made the trip in 79 days and 7 hours, which just strikes me as being a bit theatrical. So now back to Nellie. She continues to write until at 31 she marries the 73-year-old Robert Seaman. And he owns an ironworks company that makes steel bottles for milk and for boilers. And Nellie, she kind of stops work to help him run the company. But 9 years after they marry, he dies, and Nellie fully takes over operations. Nellie, after all her investigations into working people's lives, runs this company under the idea that workers should be treated well, including being provided health benefits and safe working conditions. What a revolutionary concept! She also, for what it's worth, invented a new type of milk can and a stackable type of garbage can. Yeah, like I said, for what it's worth. So it seems like Nellie is a sort of Wonder Woman. She can do anything, right? Well, maybe not. She ends up being crap at financial matters, and, well, she ends up losing the entire company. But luckily, there's a war on. And yes, that would be World War I. I am not getting that wrong this time. She ends up reporting on the Eastern Front of Europe and becomes one of the very first journalists, and certainly the first woman to report from there. When she returns home, Nellie reported on women's suffrage and other social issues. Unfortunately, in 1922, Nellie contracts pneumonia and she doesn't survive. But her story does live on, and her work did pave the way for other female journalists. So that is your 2-for-1 episode, Nellie Bly and 80 Days Around the World. If this has you curious about Nellie's journey, get your hands on a copy of 80 Days by Matthew Goodman. And of course, I will have a link in the show notes for that. It's a great read, and it really delves into an amazing adventure story and a pretty incredible lady. Okay, now it's the time of the show for updates. As for writing updates, I've just finished the second book of my Cassie Black Trilogy. Again. I know, I said this was done a few weeks ago, but that draft was mainly filling in some giant plot holes and basically rewriting a huge chunk of the book, so it really did feel done. This draft was more to see how those new additions fit into the scheme of things, and of course, some of them didn't. So I had to rearrange a few events and trickle in some more hints and teasers to set things up for the grand finale, and this is basically my final draft, so it's in this draft that I start honing the overall language just to make sure all the sentences sound pretty to my ears. But I think this is really close to done, and I've sent it off to my eagle-eyed beta readers to see what they think. And if they don't absolutely hate it, I will start in on book 3 of the trilogy. As for the podcast, there's not much other than if you're on my newsletter, you should have gotten your Book Owl coloring pages in the email for episode 12. And any new signups to the newsletter will automatically get those color pages, because I'm sure we could all use a way to take our minds off things lately. All right, everyone, that is it for the Book Owl podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed this, please tell a friend or leave a review, and I will hoot at you next time. The Book Owl podcast is a production of Daisy Dog Media. Copyright 2020, all rights reserved. The theme music was composed by Kevin MacLeod. Audio processing by ophonic.com.